Well, in our last lecture, we were looking at Florence, the economic and social structure of Florence as the context, one of the contexts of the Renaissance and humanism. In this lecture, we're going to continue with that theme by looking at the political structure and political life of Florence and seeing how that provided a context for the Renaissance. And in fact, we'll see how the Florentine political structure actually helped create the Renaissance and civic humanism. So we'll start out with a kind of brief overview of how the government worked, and then we'll look a little bit about how people were elected and served in the government. Officially, Florence was a republic. In Italy at this time, they were known as communes because they were formed when people took common oaths to serve the city. In fact, however, Florence was ruled by what we, with our modern eyes, would see as a relatively small group of wealthy men. Today we'd probably call it an oligarchy, although it really wasn't perceived that way at the time so much. And this oligarchy was made up of the members of the 7 great guilds who controlled the woolen cloth industry. So what we'll see in Florence is that city officials are elected from within a fairly small group of eligible, wealthy people. And we'll have to consider, the extent to which this qualifies actually as a republic, not to mention a democracy. But just to take a look back in time very briefly, the government of Florence had not always been so oligarchic, had not always been so restricted to just a small group of people. In the early days of the commune, when it was first kind of organized back in the 1100s, early 1200s, the government was in fact a lot more popular and a lot more democratic. But over the years, what had happened was that the rich just gradually assumed more and more power, and there was a trend towards rule by the wealthy people throughout the years. Now, this trend was, of course, reversed during the Ciampi period, from 1378 to 1381, when the lesser guilds actually seized power and controlled the government for a couple of years. Unusual in the history of Italian towns and even European towns, but for the late 14th century, not that unusual, because in the 1380s, for example, because of the plague, depression, labor shortage, there were lower guild regimes in power in a number of cities across Europe. None of them lasted very long, but at least Florence was not the only one to have a regime like the Ciampi regime. After the Ciampi period is over, though, by 1400, the great guilds are back in command, back in control, and the trend towards rule by a smaller and smaller wealthy group continues on throughout the 1400s and the 1500s, and in the Renaissance period climaxes with the Medici period. Now, this brings up a point that's been debated as to exactly how popular, how democratic this government was. Could it really be called participatory? The historian Lauro Martinez has suggested that Renaissance humanism, civic humanism, was developed as an ideology by this ruling class to legitimize their power and make it seem as though the government was more participatory and democratic than it actually was. And so if you take this interpretation, you actually see humanism as a kind of ideological program of the upper classes. I think that's not a terribly accurate description of what's going on in Florence, however. As we'll see, even though to the modern person it seems like the group of rulers in Florence is small, for the time, it actually was a fairly broad government, and there was fairly broad participation of the people in government, and I'll give you examples of that in just a couple of minutes. So I don't think people at the time would have considered it to have been a narrow government. As a matter of fact, in most countries in Europe, of course, there was simply a king who ruled and subjects who followed. Most towns were ruled by various different versions of this kind of situation. And it was about as republican a government as you would find in the early modern period. So I wouldn't really say that humanism was an attempt to cover up rule by the elite. Well, the chief organ of government in the city was the city council, and that was called the signoria. And what I want to do first is tell you how people were elected to the signoria, and you'll get some sense for not only who was elected, but how many people would be elected and serve, and you'll get a better sense for the nature of participation in this government. The elections were held, and this was fairly typical of a lot of towns in Europe, by an indirect electoral system. In Florence, it was called the scrutiny. And here's how it would work. What they would do is first, they would draw up a list of all the members of the 7 great guilds. And that would be a fairly lengthy list. This is what you have to be in the 7 great guilds to even qualify to run for office. So they make a list of people in the great guilds. Then they hand that list down to a committee, and the committee strikes names off and makes a new list, which it calls the list of eligible candidates. It will strike names off the original list in the cases that maybe a person would be in debt, because being in debt makes you liable to bribes and things like that, and it's not good to have those people in government. People who were in exile would be stricken off, obviously. People who were absent on business trips would be stricken off because they couldn't serve. People who were too sick to serve would be taken off. And finally, people who were dead would be taken off. And so then you have your list of eligibles. That's handed down to another committee, and that committee goes through a whole nother process of striking off names. I won't go through all the reasons why they strike off names here again. And this produces the final list called the list of nominees. At that point, the name of each nominee is written on a bean. A bean. The beans are put in a chest, and somebody is blindfolded, reaches in, draws beans out, and whoever's name is on the bean drawn out gets elected. Well, over the years, over the 14th century, the number of people on these various lists grew. And then at the end of the 14th century, it tended to contract again. For example, in 1343, the list of nominees, the final list, contained 300 names out of a list of eligibles of 3,000. 1361, the list of nominees contained 500 names out of a list of eligibles of 3,000. In 1382, right at the end of the Ciampi period, the list of eligibles was 5,000. The list of nominees was 750. So it's growing all through the 14th century. Then it begins to contract again as we move into the 15th century and into the rule of the wealthier families. Whoever controls these various election committees, striking off names, can basically control the election, because you can control who's eligible to be elected. And in the 15th century, for example, the powerful Medici banking family had all their friends on these committees, and they struck off people who weren't their friends and got all their friends elected. And that's how they basically ruled Florence from behind the scenes. And it was a system that was not too difficult to manipulate if you had people in the right positions. Okay, so that's how you get elected to the city council. Now, what does the city council do? The duties of the signoria. They are executive and they are administrative, but they are not policy making. There are 2 other bodies I'll tell you about later that make policy. So the signoria is going to do things like appoint judges, enforce the law, regulate commerce. It has some foreign affairs responsibilities and that kind of thing. On the signoria, or city council, there are a number of different officials, and I'll tell you about these different officials and what their duties were. First of all, the top officials were 9 men called priors, and these were 9 chief executive officers. You might think of it as 9 mayors of the city, 9 to spread out the responsibility so nobody gets too much power. Each one of the priors is elected for a term of 2 months. 2 months, and then another election for that spot. The priors live in the signoria building, which is a huge fortress-like building in the center of Florence, which you can still visit today if you go there. And it was really built to resist attack by people who didn't like what the city council was doing. Another type of official on the city council were the 12 buonomimi, or good men, the 12 good men. These 12 officials basically supervise commerce. They are elected for terms of 3 months each, and each one of them administers commerce in one section of the city. So the city is divided up into different sections, and one official regulates each one. Then you have 16 officials known as gonfalonieri. These are 16 police officials. This job actually evolved from a medieval position created to police the nobles in Florence before the nobles were kicked out in 1282. Now the gonfalonieri are just general police officials. Each one controls one section of the city, and he doesn't really have a police force. He's just like the lone official for that section of the city. There are also 15 officials known as magistrates. These are just basic administrators. They take care of day-to-day business, tax collecting, road repair, repairing the fortifications of the city, things like that, whatever jobs, mundane jobs need to get done. Now, if a really bad job came up, none of these officials would do it. They would appoint a special committee called a bailey, which would undertake the very unpopular task at hand, such as in a forced loan where the government is forcing people to loan it money, or electoral reform, reforming the process of scrutiny, or quarantining a section of the city because of the plague. And of all these jobs, probably the most unpopular, the job that no one wanted to do, was quarantine. Whenever the plague hits, and you know it hits very often, the section of the city it hits first is quarantined, cut off. Nobody can go in, nobody can go out. The people can't see their relatives in other neighborhoods. They can't do business, they can't go to work. It's a very, very unpopular kind of thing. And these committees would do it, and then after the task was over and the situation resolved, the committee would dissolve, and no one would have to accept responsibility for doing the unpopular thing. So that's pretty much how the city council worked, executive and administrative. Policy making, actually making laws and making policy for the city, was carried out by two legislative bodies. One was known as the Council of the Popolo. Popolo in Italian just means people. And the other was called the Council of the Commune. Together, these two legislative bodies had about 500 members, and each member served for a term of 6 months. They debate and they make policy. That's what they're all about. The policies they make, the laws they pronounce, are recorded, written down, and announced to the city by an official known as the chancellor. And this official actually becomes very important in Florentine government as the years go by. In the beginning, the chancellor simply represented these two legislative bodies. He would go in, listen to their debates, write down what they decided, and he would go out and announce it to the rest of the city. As the years went by, however, the chancellor gained more and more influence and then more and more power in these two legislative bodies. He came to manipulate the agendas, he came to control, or at least influence debate, and actually came to lead and direct these two bodies in their formulation of policy and law. And at that point, the chancellor had become a lot more than what he was earlier. Earlier, he was just kind of a secretary. Now, he's become almost something we would say would be equal to a prime minister. And so the chancellor becomes probably the most important official, single official, in the entire Florentine government. Because from the beginning, the duty of the chancellor was to write down laws, policies, he always had to be highly educated. And by the late 14th, early 15th century, chancellors tended to be humanist scholars, not really professional politicians so much as people who were qualified by their command of Latin and their learning to provide the functions they had to provide. And you might recall that the two founders of civic humanism in Florence, Leonardo Bruni and Lucio Saiotati, were both chancellors. Saiotati was chancellor at the very end of the 14th century, Bruni at the very beginning of the 15th century. Both of these people, as you know, had tremendous influence on the evolution of humanism and the Renaissance in Florence, but their influence started